Matthew Alden had always been a man who longed for more. Growing up in the small, weathered town of Blackwater, he'd spent his youth dreaming of wealth, prestige, and a life beyond the suffocating confines of his dreary surroundings. But the years had been unkind, leaving him a man of meager means, stuck in the dusty office of a failing business, watching the world pass him by. Until the night he found the book. It was hidden deep within the rotting walls of the old Alden estate, his family's ancestral home, a place he had avoided for years, decades even, ever since his parents' untimely deaths and the subsequent ruin of the family fortune. The house had decayed in their absence, falling victim to time, much like the rest of his life. But on that cold October evening, something had drawn him back to the crumbling mansion. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was desperation. The house was a ghost of its former self, with sagging beams and windows caked in layers of dust. The air smelled of mildew and rot, a dampness that clung to his skin as he moved through the empty rooms. He told himself he was there to salvage something valuable, maybe an old painting or a forgotten heirloom, something he could sell for a few dollars. But what he found was far more sinister. In the corner of the library, behind a wall that had long since started to crumble, Matthew's hand grazed something cool and smooth. A strange sensation crept over him, as though the house itself was watching, waiting. As the bricks crumbled away, revealing a hidden compartment, he unearthed an old, leather-bound book. It was heavier than it looked, with pages yellowed by time and ink that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The title was etched in Latin, though Matthew couldn't read it. But the feeling in his gut told him the book was no ordinary relic. His fingers trembled as he opened the cover. The first few pages were filled with strange symbols, but as he flipped further, he began to understand. Dark promises were written in cryptic prose, and though the language was archaic, the meaning became unnervingly clear. This was a book of power, forbidden power. A chill swept through the room, as though a gust of wind had passed through, but the windows were all closed. Matthew's pulse quickened, the weight of the book heavy in his hands. He had always mocked superstition, laughed at the old stories of pacts with demons and otherworldly forces. But standing there in the oppressive silence of that forsaken mansion, with that book in his hands, he began to question everything he'd ever known. The words on the page whispered to him, not audibly, but inside his mind, beckoning him to read further, to uncover the secrets hidden within. He hesitated, but something inside him, a hunger that had gnawed at him for years, urged him on. One can claim the world, the book seemed to say, if only one knows how to ask. Matthew's heart pounded. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, reading the ancient text by the dim light of a fading lamp. But as he turned the final page, his breath caught in his throat. A name, written in blood-red ink, stood out among the rest, one that every child had heard whispered in cautionary tales but never spoken aloud. Lucifer, the devil himself. A pact was described, one made in exchange for a soul, and beneath the words, in neat, spidery handwriting, was a blank space for a signature. Suddenly the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to lengthen. Matthew felt the weight of the house pressing in on him, as if it were alive. His instincts screamed for him to close the book and run, but the allure of what lay before him was irresistible. In that moment, standing in the decaying ruins of his family's estate, Matthew Alden made the decision that would change his life forever. The devil was listening. The night after Matthew found the book, sleep evaded him. His mind buzzed with possibilities, unable to shake the feeling that something far darker now lingered over his life. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself the book was just an old artifact, a relic of a bygone era, meant to scare the gullible. But deep down, he knew the truth. In the quiet hours of early morning, Matthew sat alone in his small, dim apartment. The book lay open on the table before him, its pages fluttering slightly as if moved by a breeze that wasn't there. He stared at it, his heart pounding. The words, etched in that strange red ink, seemed to glow in the faint light of his single flickering lamp. "If only one knows how to ask," the book had whispered to him in the abandoned mansion. And now, the time had come to ask. The thought terrified him. A deal with the devil. Could such a thing really be possible? And yet, as Matthew sat in the stillness, something began to change around him. The air grew heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. He could feel it, the weight of another presence, unseen but undeniably there. Then, from the shadows came a voice, deep, smooth, and unnervingly calm. "You've called, and I have come." Matthew jumped, his heart seizing in his chest. The voice came from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick, pooling like ink. And from that darkness, a figure emerged. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb the dim light. His face was pale, with sharp features that were almost beautiful, but there was something about his eyes, something ancient and cruel. The man, or whatever he was, smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You found my little book," he said, his voice like velvet. "And now you're wondering if it's real, aren't you?" Matthew swallowed hard, his throat dry. I wasn't sure it would actually—" "Oh, it's very real," the man interrupted, stepping closer, his polished shoes soundless on the floor. "The question is, do you know what you want?" Matthew's mind raced. The fear was there, a constant undercurrent, but with it came something else. Desire. The promise of power, of wealth, of everything he had spent his life dreaming of but never achieving. He looked at the man, the devil, he realized with a sinking certainty, and tried to form the words. I want more," Matthew said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want power. I want wealth. I want to be someone." The devil smiled again, his eyes gleaming with something dark and knowing. "More," he repeated softly. "That's what they all want, isn't it? More of everything. But you understand what I ask in return, don't you?" Matthew nodded, his throat tight. "My soul." The devil let out a quiet chuckle. "Your soul," he echoed, as if the very idea amused him. "Yes, that's the traditional arrangement. But there's always a price, Matthew. Power comes at a cost. Are you willing to pay it?" For a moment, Matthew hesitated. The reality of what he was about to do weighed heavily on him. But then he thought of the years he had wasted, the opportunities that had slipped through his fingers. He thought of the empty future that stretched out before him, working in that grimy little office, fading into obscurity, forgotten. And with that thought, he made his choice. "I am," he said, the words coming out more confidently than he expected. "I'll pay it." The devil's smile widened. "Good," he said, his voice soft and dangerous. "Then we have a bargain." From inside his coat, the devil produced a silver quill, its point gleaming in the dim light. He placed it on the table beside the book, the open page still waiting for Matthew's signature. The air seemed to hum with anticipation. "Sign your name," the devil instructed, and it will be done." Matthew stared at the quill, his hand trembling as he reached for it. The moment stretched on, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he dipped the quill into the ink that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere and carefully signed his name on the blank line beneath the contract. The ink glowed faintly as his signature appeared on the page, sealing his fate. "It is done," the devil murmured, and with a flick of his wrist, the book snapped shut. The shadows in the room seemed to ripple, and for a brief moment, the air grew so cold that Matthew could see his breath. Then, just as suddenly, the heaviness lifted. The devil stood tall, looking pleased. "Enjoy your newfound fortune," he said with a wink. "I'll be seeing you, Matthew." And with that, he vanished, leaving behind only the lingering chill and the oppressive silence that followed. Matthew sat alone in the room, the weight of the bargain settling in. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, but the world suddenly felt darker than it had before. The transformation in Matthew's life was swift, almost dizzying in its speed. Just days after signing his name in the Devil's Book, everything began to change. It started small at first, unexpected windfalls that seemed like coincidence. A promotion at his job, an inheritance from a distant relative he barely remembered, and then larger and stranger fortunes followed. It was as if the universe had suddenly shifted to align in his favor. Business deals that had been failing for years turned profitable overnight. His investments soared, and soon he was able to leave his shabby apartment for an upscale penthouse in the city. His name appeared in magazines, whispered in exclusive circles of power, and the once forgotten Matthew Alden became a man of influence and fortune. But with the rise of his success, the shadows grew. It started with the whispers, soft at first, barely noticeable. When Matthew was alone in his office or walking down a quiet hallway, he could hear faint murmurs just on the edge of perception. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, indistinct and fleeting, vanishing the moment he tried to listen closely, but they carried an unmistakable weight, as if something or someone was watching. At first, Matthew dismissed them. Stress, he told himself. It was the pressure of his newfound responsibilities, the constant strain of maintaining his success. He convinced himself that the whispers were nothing more than his imagination, a small price to pay for the life he had always dreamed of. But the strange occurrences began to intensify. On a cold evening in late November, Matthew attended a high-profile gala surrounded by the city's elite. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of conversation. Yet, amidst the celebration, Matthew felt a growing unease, a sense that he didn't belong, an intruder in his own life. As the night wore on, he stepped out onto the balcony to catch his breath. The air was sharp with the bite of winter, but the quiet was a welcome relief from the noise inside. He stood alone, gazing out over the glittering city lights, when he felt it, a presence behind him. Matthew turned quickly, his pulse quickening, but the balcony was empty. Only the cold wind swirled around him. Yet, there had been something. He was sure of it. A faint movement, a ripple in the air, like a shadow that shouldn't be there. Shaking off the feeling, he went back inside, but the unease lingered. The incidents grew stranger. At home, lights would flicker when he walked into a room, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. He'd wake in the dead of night, certain he had heard footsteps just outside his bedroom door, only to find nothing when he investigated. And always there were the whispers, soft, unintelligible, yet somehow full of intent. One evening, while reviewing documents in his study, the pages of a contract suddenly turned by themselves. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though an invisible hand was guiding them. Matthew froze, staring in disbelief. The room had been still, no draft, no movement. And yet, the papers moved. It was then that the realization began to sink in. The bargain was not as simple as it had seemed. The devil had kept his promise, yes, but something dark had come with it. Something that was beginning to unravel the very edges of Matthew's life. In the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, a gnawing dread began to creep into his mind. He could feel it, a presence that lurked just out of sight, waiting. Sometimes, in the mirror, he would catch a glimpse of something behind him, just a fleeting shadow. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing, except the growing sense that his life was no longer entirely his own. As the weeks passed, Matthew's success continued to build, but the cost became harder to ignore. He started to hear voices, clearer now, calling his name in the dark. They came when he was alone, always just out of reach, but their meaning was clear. They were reminding him of the price he had yet to fully pay. And with each passing day, the shadows that followed him grew darker, more persistent. He had everything he had ever wanted. But for the first time, Matthew began to wonder if the price of his fortune was far higher than he could ever afford. The cracks in Matthew's perfect life began to show. On the surface, he was still the man everyone envied, rich, powerful, and untouchable. But beneath the luxury and influence, he felt a constant weight, pressing down on him with increasing force. The whispers had grown louder, no longer content to haunt the quiet corners of his mind. Now they followed him everywhere, even in crowded rooms, their voices laced with something darker than before. A warning. One cold December night, after another lavish dinner with the city's elite, Matthew returned home to find the grand foyer of his penthouse cloaked in shadows. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the stillness. There was a chill in the air that hadn't been there before, a coldness that seeped into his bones. The house felt wrong, as though it was no longer entirely his. Something was waiting for him. He ignored the feeling and poured himself a glass of whiskey, but his hand shook as he lifted it to his lips. He hadn't been able to sleep properly for weeks now. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard those whispers, clearer with each passing night, their tone almost taunting now. Sometimes they called his name. Other times they said things he couldn't quite understand, but the meaning was always clear. The clock was ticking, and the price of his fortune was about to come due. As he stared into his glass, he heard it again. Footsteps. This time there was no mistaking it. Slow, deliberate, moving just outside the door to his study. Matthew's pulse quickened, but he remained still, listening. The sound stopped just outside the door, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a shock of cold terror through Matthew's chest. He stood, his heart pounding. The room felt like it was closing in around him. He moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, uncertain whether to open it or flee. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Summoning what little courage he had left, Matthew yanked the door open. No one stood there. The hallway beyond was empty, but the cold remained. And in that moment, Matthew realized something. It wasn't the house that had changed. It was him. The deal he had made was like a stain on his soul, something that couldn't be washed away. The devil was not just watching him from afar. He was here, in his home, in every shadow and every whisper. Desperation clawed at him. He couldn't go on like this, living in constant fear. He needed answers. He needed a way out, That night, Matthew reached out to an old family friend, an eccentric man named Victor Royce. Victor had once been a renowned scholar of the occult, though most people dismissed him as a lunatic after his research into the dark arts drove him into isolation. Matthew had avoided him for years, embarrassed by the connection, but now he had nowhere else to turn. Victor agreed to meet him the next evening. When Matthew arrived at his decrepit house on the outskirts of town, he was met with the scent of burning herbs and candles flickering in every corner of the dimly lit room. "You've meddled in things you don't understand, Matthew," Victor said gravely as they sat in the cluttered study. "Once you make a pact with the devil, there's no easy way out." "I don't care about easy," Matthew said, his voice raw with fear and frustration. "There must be something I can do, some way to break the contract." Victor studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "The devil's deals are ironclad, but there are loopholes, dangerous ones." He hesitated. "You could try to outwit him, force him to break his own terms." "How?" Victor's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The contract you signed, it's bound to you by your own hand. If you can destroy the physical contract without the devil's knowledge, the bond might break. But I warn you, the devil doesn't take kindly to those who try to trick him." Matthew's heart raced. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only hope he had. "Where's the contract kept?" Victor frowned. "That's the hard part. The moment you signed, the devil took possession of it. You'll have to summon him again and find a way to destroy it in his presence, without alerting him to your intentions." A chill ran down Matthew's spine. He had already called the devil once, but doing it again with the intent to betray him felt like walking into his own execution. As Matthew left Victor's house, the shadows seemed to follow him, thicker than before, almost alive. His mind raced with the enormity of what lay ahead. The devil was not easily fooled, and failure would mean far worse than death. The price of power was more than Matthew had ever imagined, and the full weight of it was about to fall. The days leading up to the final confrontation passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, following Matthew like silent sentinels. No matter where he went, the boardroom, his lavish home, or even the bustling streets of the city, he felt them, always watching, always waiting. Every time he looked into a mirror, he caught glimpses of movement behind him, flickers of shapes that disappeared the moment he turned his head. At night, the whispers came again, louder than ever, filling his mind with thoughts he couldn't quite make out, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Time was running out. Matthew knew he had to act soon before the devil came to collect. Summoning the devil again was no small task. The first time it had been almost accidental, a desperate wish whispered into the void that had been answered in the darkest way possible. But now, Matthew had to be deliberate. He needed to draw the devil into his trap without revealing his intentions. He spent hours preparing, going through the instructions Victor had given him in their last meeting. It wasn't enough just to summon the devil. He had to find a way to manipulate the situation, to get close enough to the contract without alerting the devil to his plan. One wrong move and the consequences would be unimaginable. The night of the summoning, Matthew sat in the center of his study, the book of ancient rites open on the desk before him. The room was dark, save for the flickering light of a few candles that cast long, trembling shadows across the walls. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the very space around him was holding its breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he recited the words from the book. Latin phrases slipped from his lips, trembling and uneven, filling the room with an eerie, otherworldly resonance. For a moment, Nothing happened. The candles flickered and a cold breeze swept through the room, but there was no sign of the dark figure he had called for. Then, from the shadows in the corner, the devil stepped forward. He looked the same as he had the night Matthew first summoned him. Tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. His smile was slow, deliberate, like a man greeting an old friend. "Matthew," the devil purred, his voice like velvet. "I must say, it's rare to receive a second invitation so soon. Are you not satisfied with the gifts I've given you?" Matthew swallowed hard, forcing his fear down. I need more time," he said, his voice barely steady. "The price. I wasn't prepared for it." The devil's eyes gleamed, his smile never faltering. But a deal is a deal, Matthew. You knew what you were agreeing to." "I know," Matthew said quickly, "but I was hoping there might be a way to renegotiate. Just for a little longer. A few more years." The devil chuckled softly, a sound that sent a chill down Matthew's spine. "Time is not something I often extend. Souls, however." He paused, watching Matthew carefully. "Well, they are quite valuable." Matthew's hands trembled, his pulse racing. He had to get closer, had to find the contract. Victor had told him it would be near, somewhere in the devil's possession. He just needed to distract him long enough to locate it. "You said I could have the world," Matthew said, his voice stronger now, desperation creeping into his words. "But I need more. There's so much more I could do, so much more power I could have, with just a little more time." The devil tilted his head, considering him, amusement flickering behind those ancient eyes. "More power," he repeated. "How typical of mortals. But you've already asked for more once. What do you have to offer me this time?" Matthew's mind raced. He needed to buy just a little more time. His eyes scanned the room as he spoke, looking for any sign of the contract, anything that could be the key to breaking his bond. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, resting on the edge of the devil's coat pocket. A thin, leather-bound book. The contract. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. The very object that held his soul in its grip. Now, he just needed to get to it. "I can offer you influence," Matthew said, trying to keep the devil's attention on him. "I can make more deals for you, bring more souls to you. I can..." The devil's smile widened. But I have no shortage of souls, Matthew. Yours is the one I'm most interested in." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The devil's eyes gleamed with dark amusement, and for the briefest moment, Matthew saw something flicker behind that smile. An awareness. He knew. Before Matthew could react, the devil's hand moved quicker than a blink, grasping the small book from his pocket and holding it up for Matthew to see. "Looking for this?" the devil asked, his voice low, dangerous. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Matthew's heart dropped. He had been too slow, too obvious. And now the unseen hand of the devil was tightening its grip, more deadly than he had ever imagined. Matthew's breath caught in his throat as the devil held up the contract, the thin, leather-bound book glowing faintly in the candlelight. The flicker of amusement in the devil's eyes chilled Matthew to the core. He had underestimated the creature, thought he could outwit the very embodiment of deception. Now, standing before him, Matthew realized how small and powerless he truly was. The devil flipped through the pages of the contract slowly, deliberately, like a man savoring a familiar story. "You disappoint me, Matthew," he said, his voice soft, laced with an almost playful cruelty. I gave you everything you wanted, and in return you sought to betray me. Matthew's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear the devil's words over the rush of blood in his ears. Desperation clawed at him, but his mind felt blank, unable to form a coherent plan. The shadows in the room seemed to swell, pressing in on him, making it harder to breathe. The air was thick with the weight of his impending doom. "I wasn't trying to," Matthew stammered, but the devil cut him off with a wave of his hand, silencing him. "Oh, don't insult me with lies," the devil said, his tone almost bored. "You think you're the first to try and slip out of our agreement? You mortals always think you can play both sides, but there's a reason I've been doing this for so long." Matthew swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the contract again. He knew it was his only chance, the only way to sever the bond. But how could he get to it now? How could he destroy it with the devil standing right there, watching his every move? The devil's smile faded, replaced by a cold, predatory expression. "You were given time, Matthew. Time to enjoy the fruits of our deal. But all deals have an end, and yours has come." Panic surged through Matthew. "Wait!" he blurted out, stepping forward, his voice shaking. "There has to be something, anything I can do. I'll give you more souls, more influence, whatever you want. Just don't take mine. Not yet." The devil tilted his head as if considering the offer, but his eyes remained cold. "You've already given me everything you had to offer, Matthew. Your soul is mine, as agreed. There are no renegotiations." Matthew's legs felt weak, and he stumbled back, his mind racing. He couldn't let it end like this. Not after everything. He glanced again at the contract, still held loosely in the devil's hand, and a dangerous idea took root in his mind. He had no choice. If he was going to survive, he would have to act now, before the devil could stop him. Without warning, Matthew lunged forward, his hand reaching desperately for the contract. His fingers brushed the edge of the leather cover, but before he could grasp it, the devil moved. Faster than Matthew could see, the devil's hand shot out, seizing Matthew's wrist in an iron grip. A searing, unbearable pain shot through Matthew's arm, as if his very bones were being crushed by the weight of the devil's touch. He cried out, collapsing to his knees, his vision swimming with agony. The devil leaned down, his face inches from Matthew's, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Matthew gasped for breath, his entire body trembling. The pain in his wrist was blinding, but worse than that was the cold, gnawing fear that gripped his soul. He had failed. The contract was still intact, and now the devil had him. The devil straightened, releasing Matthew's wrist, and for a moment, the room was deathly silent. The flickering candles cast long, twisting shadows on the walls, and the oppressive weight of the darkness seemed to close in tighter. Matthew knelt there, trembling, his mind frantically searching for another way out. But there was nothing. "Your time has come, Matthew," the devil said quietly, almost gently. "It's time to pay the price." Matthew's breath came in ragged gasps. He felt the darkness pressing in, the weight of his own fate descending like a heavy shroud. And then, in a moment of clarity, a thought pierced through the fog of fear. The devil had one weakness: pride. He relished his role as the ultimate dealer in deception, but that pride could be his downfall. If Matthew could play on it, just for a moment, perhaps he could create the smallest opening. "You're right," Matthew said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've beaten me. I can't escape." The devil's eyes narrowed, watching him carefully. "But before you take my soul," Matthew continued, his voice trembling with forced humility, "I want to know, how did you do it? How did you play me so perfectly? I thought I had it all figured out, but you outsmarted me at every turn." The devil's expression remained unreadable, but Matthew could see the flicker of amusement returning to his eyes. "Flattery, Matthew?" the devil asked, his tone mocking. "You think you can buy yourself time with compliments?" "No," Matthew said quickly. I want to know. You're the master of this game, aren't you? Just tell me how you did it, before you take everything from me." For a moment, the devil seemed to consider. Then slowly he smiled. "Very well," he said, his voice smooth again. "You've earned at least that much." As the devil spoke, explaining the intricacies of how he had manipulated Matthew's every decision, Matthew's gaze flickered to the contract still in the devil's hand. His heart raced as he listened, pretending to be engrossed in the explanation, biding his time. And then, in one swift, desperate movement, Matthew snatched the contract from the devil's hand and threw it into the flames of the nearest candle. The devil's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, cold rage. For a brief moment, the contract burned, the edges curling and blackening in the fire. But before it could be fully consumed, the devil snapped his fingers and the flames died, leaving the book half charred. "You fool," the devil hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you really think you could destroy your fate?" Matthew stared at the smoldering remains of the contract, his heart pounding. The damage had been done, but the price of his defiance would be steep. "Your soul may be spared," the devil said, his eyes burning with fury. "But the shadows will follow you for the rest of your days. You will never escape what you've invited into your life, Matthew. This, I promise." The room fell into an eerie silence, and when Matthew looked up, the devil was gone. But the shadows remained, and Matthew knew, deep down, they always would.